All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we're diving deep into one of the most infamous stories of all time, Sodom and Gomorrah.
Oh, yeah. Those names definitely ring a bell. Fire and brimstone, right.
Exactly. But we're going beyond that well-known image, kind of peeling back the layers to uncover some surprising insights from the Bible and get this, even recent archaeological discoveries.
You had me at archaeological discovery, so what sources are we talking about here?
Well, we've got Genesis, of course, Ezekiel, even some intriguing mentions in 2 Peter and Jude. We'll try to weave those together to understand not just what went down, but why this story still has so much power today, thousands of years later.
Yeah, it's a story that's really captivated people across cultures and centuries. There's definitely something about it that just sticks with you.
For sure. And to add to that, we've got some intel from actual archaeological sites, Bab Edra and Numera, thought to be near where these cities once stood. It's like having puzzle pieces from different sources, and we're going to try to put them together.
I love a good historical puzzle. But before we get ahead of ourselves, can we just, set the scene, remind everyone of the basics?
Absolutely. So picture this. It's the time of Abraham, known for being a righteous dude, but he's living among these, well, let's call them morally questionable cities of the plain.
Right, and Sodom and Gomorrah are like the headliners of this not-so-great lineup.
Exactly. Genesis describes their sin as so bad it, reached up to heaven. Talk about a bad reputation.
Yikes, that's not a good Yelp review.
Not at all. So we've got this stark contrast. Abraham, known for his hospitality and faith, and then these cities, totally consumed by wickedness. What exactly were they up to, besides just being generally bad?
Well, the common assumption is that it was all about, sexual immorality. And while that's definitely part of the story, if you look at Ezekiel 16, it paints a much bigger picture.
Bigger? How so?
It's like they were drowning in their own wealth and comfort, totally ignoring the needs of the poor and needy, arrogance, abundance of food while others starved. It's a whole societal mess.
So thinking about ancient cultures, where hospitality was a huge deal, I wonder if this disregard for those in need also played into how they treated strangers.
You're totally on the right track there. Back then, welcoming travelers and offering them protection was like a sacred duty. It's like the opposite of what Airbnb reviews are for today, but even more important. And Sodom and Gomorrah seem to have completely abandoned that, which, spoiler alert, plays a key role in their downfall.
Speaking of visitors, it's interesting that when the angels show up to investigate these cities, it's Lot, Abraham's nephew, who lives in Sodom, who's the one who welcomes them. Like a glimmer of decency in a very dark place.
It's kind of amazing, right? Genesis 19 describes him going out to meet them, bowing down low, insisting they stay at his place. He's putting a lot of effort into welcoming them, which makes you wonder if maybe he already senses how dangerous the city really is.
Given how important hospitality was, do you think Lot's insistence on welcoming the angels, even when they initially hesitated, was brave or maybe a little, misguided?
That's a really good question. I mean, on one hand, he's sticking to those ancient customs, even when it seems risky. But on the other hand, what happens later when he offers his daughters to the mob to protect his guests, that's really messed up.
Yeah, that's definitely a disturbing turn of events. We'll unpack that more a bit later. But first, let's talk about that mob scene outside Lot's house. The text specifically says they want to know the visitors.
Ugh, yeah, it's a chilling scene. And while, yeah, there's definitely a sexual element there, there's something even deeper going on, too. It's like they're completely rejecting that ancient duty to protect guests. They want to control, dominate. It goes way beyond lust.
And in that cultural context, to violate hospitality like that, it was a huge offense, arguably worse than some forms of sexual immorality, especially given that these cities were on trade routes. They relied on welcoming travelers.
Totally. It's like biting the hand that feeds you, but on a much larger scale. They built their prosperity on the very custom they're now trampling.
It's almost like they're inviting their own destruction.
You could say that. But, we still need to go back to that disturbing moment with Lot and his daughters. It speaks to something really profound about the nature of sin and its consequences.
Let's definitely dive into that. It's a tough but important part of the story. So we were talking about, a pretty messed up part of the story, Lot offering his daughters to that mob.
Yeah, it's a tough one. But it's important to think about the historical context, In ancient cultures, having sons was like everything. Lineage, inheritance. It wasn't just about family. It was about survival.
So for Lot to even consider this, he must have been absolutely desperate, trying to uphold that hospitality custom no matter what, even if it meant doing something horrific.
Right. Twisted logic for sure, but it shows how deeply those values were ingrained. And honestly, it speaks to how bad things were in Sodom. Like, basic human decency had gone out the window.
And then, wow, the aftermath of all this is intense. Fire and brimstone raining down, those cities completely wiped out. It's a pretty apocalyptic image.
Yeah, no kidding. And even when they're escaping, Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt, it's like a haunting reminder of the past they're trying to get away from.
And then there's the story of Lot's daughters in the cave.
Yeah.
Fearing they're the last ones left, they get their father drunk and... Well, it's a disturbing passage. But what does it say about the lasting impact of all this?
It really shows how much your environment shapes you. These women had just seen their whole world destroyed. They were dealing with trauma, and they made choices that, while definitely wrong, also show how broken things were.
It's like their actions were terrible, but you can't help but feel for them a little. They were products of this messed up society, carrying all that baggage.
Absolutely. And it makes you think about how the consequences of sin, they can ripple out, touch people and generations way beyond the original act.
It's like a chain reaction, almost. And that brings us to how the story gets used in the New Testament, right? It's not just a history lesson. It becomes this powerful symbol, this warning.
Exactly. It gets woven into teachings about judgment, about the dangers of straying from God.
So how do the New Testament writers use it? Is it just about, condemning same-sex relationships, as some people claim?
It's way more complex than that. Look at 2 Peter, for example. He's using Sodom and Gomorrah to warn about divine judgment. Condemned to ashes, he says, an example of what happens to the ungodly.
So he's saying, hey, this could happen to anyone who chooses a wicked life. But what does he mean by ungodly? Is it that simple?
Peter and a lot of other New Testament writers, they're using Sodom and Gomorrah as shorthand for a whole bunch of sins.
Yes.
Sexual immorality, yeah, but also arrogance, greed, neglecting the poor, turning away from God. It's about a society falling apart morally and in terms of justice.
And Jude, in his letter, he also talks about Sodom, right?
He does, and he calls out their sexual immorality and perversion. He uses those words. But he's also making a bigger point, saying they're examples of folks who deny God and twist his grace.
So it's more about rejecting God, not just one specific sin. But how does that relate to us today? Should we be, constantly looking for signs of the apocalypse?
I don't think it's about living in fear. It's more like a mirror, making us look at our own choices, what we're doing. Are there hidden sins in our own lives, things we're ignoring, maybe even contributing to?
That's a tough question. That makes you think about our world today. Income inequality, environmental destruction, people suffering.
Exactly. And even something like hospitality. Think about how we treat refugees, immigrants, even people who just disagree with us. Are we being welcoming, open, or are we more like closing ourselves off?
Wow, that hits home. Like this story from so long ago, it's not just about condemning the past. It's a wake-up call for right now, a challenge to do better, be better.
I think so. But to really get that, we need to go even further, beyond the biblical account and to what archaeology tells us.
Because for a long time, people thought Sodom and Gomorrah were just made-up stories, right? To teach a lesson.
Yeah, a lot of scholars believed that. But recent digs near the Dead Sea, they're changing things. Sites like Bab Edra, Numera, going back to the Bronze Age, they show signs of real cities matching the biblical timeline.
So we're not just dealing with a myth. These were real places, real people who lived and made choices that had consequences.
Exactly. And get this, these excavations are showing evidence of trade routes, economic activity, which backs up what the Bible says about hospitality being so important there.
It's like the story becomes even more real, more powerful, when you connect those dots, the symbolic meaning with the historical reality. But how do we apply those ancient lessons today? What are the hidden sins we might be missing right now?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's one we're going to tackle head-on when we come back.
All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been, kind of dissecting this story of Sodom and Gomorrah, looking for those hidden sins that ultimately led to their demise.
We've definitely uncovered a lot, haven't we? It's more than just a story about divine punishment. It's about morality, justice, and surprisingly, the crucial role of hospitality.
It really makes you think about how those ancient lessons, they still resonate in our world today. So for this last part of our dive, let's shift gears a little. What can we do, practically, to avoid those same pitfalls, to build a better world?
Well, I think it starts with each of us taking a hard look in the mirror, being honest with ourselves. Are we contributing to the problems, even in subtle ways? Are we ignoring injustice? Maybe prioritizing our own comfort over the needs of others?
Yeah, it's easy to blame society or point fingers, but real change has to start with us, right? Individual accountability.
Absolutely. We got to ask ourselves, am I part of the problem or am I part of the solution?
So once we've done that soul searching, what's next? How do we actually make a difference?
Well, one way to tackle that sin of neglecting others is through generosity and service. Donating to charities, volunteering, or even just helping someone out in our daily lives, there are tons of ways to make a tangible impact.
And it doesn't always have to be some grand gesture, right?
Mhm.
Even small acts of kindness can add up. A smile, a kind word, those seemingly little things can really brighten someone's day.
For sure. And then there's that whole hospitality thing. It was a major factor in Sodom and Gomorrah's downfall. So how do we practice radical hospitality today?
That's a big question. I guess it starts with being more welcoming to refugees, immigrants, people who are different from us, building bridges instead of walls, being open to different viewpoints.
You're getting it. It's about expanding our definition of neighbor, breaking down those barriers, creating a more welcoming world for everyone.
It sounds like a real shift in mindset, moving away from fear and judgment toward empathy and understanding.
Exactly. And there's one more piece to this. Cultivating spiritual awareness. Just like Sodom and Gomorrah, we can lose our moral compass if we neglect that inner connection.
What do you mean by spiritual awareness? Like, how do we do that?
It's different for everyone. Maybe it's prayer, meditation, connecting with nature, something bigger than yourself. It's about grounding yourself in your values, seeking guidance from something beyond the everyday noise.
Finding that inner compass, huh?
Yeah.
Something to guide us when the world feels chaotic.
Yeah, exactly. And at the end of the day, I think that's what this story is all about. Our choices matter. They have consequences, not just for us, but for everyone. But it's also a call to action, a reminder that we have the power to choose good, to choose compassion, to choose hospitality.
Wow, that's powerful. As we wrap up our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. If inhospitality was so central to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, what does that say about how we treat the most vulnerable in our world today? How can we extend that radical welcome to refugees, immigrants, anyone who's been pushed to the margins? That's something to really think about.
I love that. May we all strive to make the world a little bit better, a little more compassionate, a little more just, a lot more hospitable.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep asking those tough questions.